Few philosophers have been as fiercely debated as Friedrich Nietzsche. To some, he was a prophet of self-overcoming, a man who dared to challenge the deepest assumptions of morality and existence. To others, he was a dangerous thinker whose ideas led to nihilism, elitism, and even totalitarian ideologies. But was Nietzsche truly the radical he is often made out to be? Or has history distorted his legacy beyond recognition? Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a world still deeply rooted in religious tradition and absolute moral values. Unlike many philosophers who sought to reinforce these foundations, Nietzsche spent his life deconstructing them. His critiques of Christianity, conventional morality, and societal norms were shocking, even offensive to his contemporaries. But what made him unique was not just his radical ideas, it was the poetic, almost prophetic way in which he expressed them. He didn't argue in the dry, logical style of other philosophers. Instead, he wrote in aphorisms, parables, and passionate declarations, making his works both profound and, at times, dangerously easy to misinterpret. Nietzsche's writing style and controversial ideas naturally attracted extreme reactions. Some intellectuals admired him as a fearless truth seeker who exposed the hypocrisy of societal norms. Others saw him as a reckless destroyer of values, a philosopher whose work could justify oppression and moral decay. His critique of conventional morality, especially his rejection of the idea that suffering is inherently noble, alienated many who saw self-sacrifice as the highest virtue. At the same time, his call for the individual to rise beyond societal limitations and embrace their own power was misread as an endorsement of tyranny. Ironically, the very nature of his philosophy, one that encouraged questioning everything, became its own curse, leading to endless reinterpretations and distortions. Nietzsche's legacy remains as conflicted as his philosophy. Was he a misunderstood visionary, a thinker ahead of his time whose ideas were twisted by those who came after him? Or was he a dangerous radical, planting the seeds of ideas that could be, and were, weaponized? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the labels we assign to him, but in the willingness to engage with his work beyond the surface-level caricatures. To understand Nietzsche, we must move past the myths and see the man behind the controversy. God is dead. 3 words that have echoed through time, misunderstood, misquoted, and misused in ways Nietzsche himself could never have imagined. For some, this phrase is seen as a celebration of atheism, a triumphant rejection of religion. For others, it is a blasphemous declaration, a symbol of Nietzsche's supposed nihilism. But what if both interpretations miss the point entirely? What if Nietzsche wasn't celebrating or condemning, but rather mourning? The death of God, as Nietzsche saw it, was not an act of rebellion. It was a consequence, a terrifying realization that the foundations of meaning had crumbled beneath humanity's feet. When Nietzsche wrote these words in The Gay Science, he did so through the voice of a madman, a figure who rushes into a marketplace, lantern in hand, proclaiming that we have killed God, yet failing to find an audience that understands the weight of what he is saying. This is not the voice of arrogance, but of despair. Nietzsche recognized that the old certainties, faith, divine authority, moral absolutes, were fading in the wake of science, secularism, and modernity. But instead of seeing this as a victory, he saw it as a crisis. Without God, where would meaning come from? What would replace the moral frameworks that had guided humanity for centuries? The madman does not celebrate, he warns. And few were willing to listen. This is where the greatest misunderstanding arises. Many take Nietzsche's proclamation as an invitation to nihilism, as if he were saying that, without God, nothing matters. But Nietzsche feared nihilism more than anything. To him, the death of God was not an endpoint, but a challenge, a void that had to be filled, lest humanity fall into despair and meaninglessness. His entire philosophy, from the will to power to the concept of the Übermensch, was an attempt to answer this existential crisis. If the old values had collapsed, New ones had to be created. The individual had to take responsibility for meaning itself. The danger was not the absence of God, but what humanity would do in the aftermath. And yet, history took his words in unexpected directions. Some radical secularists embraced God is dead as a war cry, stripping it of its nuance. Some political ideologies twisted his ideas into justifications for power and destruction. Even religious critics misrepresented him, turning him into the very nihilist he warned against. But Nietzsche was never an advocate of despair. He was a philosopher of transformation. He did not declare the death of God to revel in it, but to force humanity to confront the void it had created. The real question is not whether God is dead, but whether we have understood what that means. Society has always had a complicated relationship with those who refuse to conform. Rebels, visionaries, and outsiders have often been feared, hated, or even destroyed, not necessarily because they were wrong, but because they threatened the comfort of the majority. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this tension better than most. His philosophy was, at its core, a call for the individual to rise beyond the collective, to reject imposed values and create their own. But in a world that thrives on sameness, such a message was bound to be met with hostility. Was Nietzsche simply advocating for personal strength, or was he endorsing dangerous elitism? To those who misunderstood him, the line between inspiration and arrogance seemed dangerously thin. At the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy lies the idea of the Übermensch, the overman, the figure who transcends conventional morality and forges their own path. For Nietzsche, the Übermensch was not a ruler or a tyrant, but a symbol of human potential. He rejected the idea that people should live passively, submitting to inherited traditions and external authorities. Instead, he believed in self-overcoming, the constant process of questioning, growing, and pushing beyond limitations. But this kind of transformation is not easy, nor is it welcomed by those who benefit from conformity. When someone refuses to follow the script society has written for them, they provoke fear, resentment, and often outright hostility. This is where Nietzsche introduced one of his most controversial concepts: ressentiment. He argued that many moral values, particularly those rooted in religious and social traditions, were born not out of virtue, but out of bitterness. Those who felt powerless, instead of striving to improve themselves, created a morality that painted strength as evil and weakness as good. Sacrifice became noble, ambition became sinful, and suffering was seen as a sign of righteousness. In Nietzsche's view, this led to a world where the strong were condemned simply for being strong, and the individual was shamed for trying to rise above the herd. It was not morality based on truth, but on revenge, a hidden resentment against those who dared to be more. But here is where Nietzsche becomes truly dangerous in the eyes of society. He does not offer comfort, only challenge. He forces us to ask whether we are living by our own values or by those imposed upon us. Are we truly moral, or are we simply afraid? Are we guided by genuine belief or by resentment toward those who have something we do not? These are not easy questions, and they make Nietzsche an uncomfortable philosopher to confront. To some, his ideas are liberating, a call to embrace individuality and break free from false virtues. To others, they are deeply unsettling, even offensive. After all, it is far easier to label a radical as dangerous than to ask whether they might be right. Few ideas in philosophy have been as frequently misinterpreted as Nietzsche's concept of the will to power. To some, it is a doctrine of brute force, a justification for domination and control. To others, it is a key to self-mastery and personal transformation. But what did Nietzsche truly mean? Unlike many philosophical principles that deal with external structures, society, politics, morality, the will to power is something far more personal. It is not about ruling over others. It is about overcoming oneself. And yet, history has often twisted it into something far darker. For Nietzsche, all living things are driven by a fundamental force, not survival, not happiness, but power. But power, in his sense, is not simply control over others. It is the force behind growth, ambition, and creation. It is the drive that pushes an artist to paint, a thinker to question, an athlete to train. It is not about oppression, but about expansion, the desire to overcome limits, to refine oneself, to become more than one was before. And yet, because power is such a loaded word, many have assumed Nietzsche was promoting tyranny. This is where the distortion begins. The danger of the will to power lies not in Nietzsche's philosophy itself, but in how it has been misused. Some political movements have taken it as a justification for conquest, reducing it to a simplistic might makes right ideology. Others have interpreted it as a cold, ruthless approach to life, where only the strongest deserve to thrive. But Nietzsche's true vision was far more complex. He did not see power as a means of crushing others, but as a process of self-creation. True power, for him, was the ability to shape one's own destiny, to rise above mediocrity, and to reject the comforting lies that keep most people complacent. But there is a reason why Nietzsche's ideas unsettle so many. The will to power challenges the very notion of stability. It suggests that life is not about finding peace, but about continuous struggle and reinvention. This is not a philosophy for the comfortable. It is a philosophy for those willing to confront uncertainty, even suffering, in the pursuit of something greater. And perhaps that is why Nietzsche remains so divisive. His ideas, when stripped of distortion, do not justify domination. They demand transformation. The real question is not whether we accept or reject the will to power, but whether we are willing to face what it asks of us. Friedrich Nietzsche's name has been associated with some of the most extreme ideologies in modern history, particularly those linked to fascism and totalitarianism. His works, once misunderstood and often misused, became rallying cries for movements that sought power and control. But to reduce Nietzsche's philosophy to the actions of others is not only unfair, it's dangerously simplistic. The real question is not whether Nietzsche's ideas can be twisted, but why they were so easily co-opted, and whether that was ever his intention. Nietzsche himself had little regard for nationalism or the state. In fact, he saw the state as a mechanism for suppressing individual greatness, an institution that would often try to stifle the very creativity and freedom he championed. So, how did his philosophy end up becoming associated with authoritarianism? The answer lies, in part, with Nietzsche's own sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who edited and published many of his works after his mental collapse. Elisabeth, a fervent nationalist and anti-Semite, selectively preserved and altered Nietzsche's ideas to fit her own political agenda. This distortion of Nietzsche's true vision was compounded by others in the early 20th century who sought to weaponize his ideas for their own purposes. In this way, Nietzsche's philosophy was hijacked, taken out of context, and used to justify some of the very things he would have condemned. This misrepresentation has persisted over the decades, and Nietzsche's name continues to be invoked in political debates and discussions about power, identity, and authority. Yet, despite the clear political manipulation of his works, Nietzsche's true philosophy remains radically humanistic. His call for the individual to transcend the herd mentality, to create meaning in a meaningless world, and to embrace life in all its chaos is deeply at odds with the rigid, hierarchical systems that would later claim to be his ideological descendants. Nietzsche's legacy, then, is one of deep contradiction. His ideas have inspired both liberation and oppression, creation and destruction. But to understand him fully, we must separate the man from the myth, the philosopher from the politics. Nietzsche was not a prophet of hatred or violence, but of struggle and transformation. He did not advocate for the domination of others, but for the dominion of the self, an ownership of one's own path, free from the constraints of societal dogma. So why does everyone hate Nietzsche? Perhaps it's not because of what he said, but because of how uncomfortable his ideas make us. Nietzsche's philosophy forces us to face the darkest corners of ourselves and society, our resentments, our fears, and our complicity in the status quo. To engage with Nietzsche is to question everything, including the values that we hold most dear. It's easy to misunderstand him, easier still to dismiss him. But the real challenge is not to defend or attack Nietzsche. It's to understand why his ideas continue to provoke such strong reactions and what they reveal about our own world today.